You're listening to the Kitchen Confession Podcast with Chef Mary Mammoliti.
Winemakers deal with vintage. During harvest, they begin the creation of that vintage's wine, and they'll work on that for as long as necessary. It is what makes wine precious and special. What wine does is capture our history, traps a year in a bottle, and it has the essence of the place that it's grown. It has the essence of the cellar it was raised in.
I'm Mary Mammoliti, and this is the Kitchen Confession Podcast. We've been chatting with some taste experts to learn more about developing our palates. Today, we're talking to Caroline, owner of the Grange of Prince Edward Winery. So tell me a little bit about the winery, about yourself, how you ended up doing this, getting involved in winemaking.
So around here, often, particularly if you're talking to my parents, it's all my fault. So the Grange is actually established and located on the family farm that my father bought when I was a little girl. I came back to the country, to the farm, after leaving for quite a while with 3 small children. And the only thing I knew at that time was that I really wanted them to have the same childhood I had, to have the freedom that living in the country offers children. The idea to start planting grapes, I think, on the farm grew in my thoughts, because I came back just as the discovery that vinifera grapes really could grow in Prince Edward County. And I think the little idea I had to plant 10 acres on the family farm was part of that sort of grand experiment.
Did you know anything about winemaking?
No. At a high level, I knew. I understood what made wine great, and the thinking and the farming behind wine in general. And I did go back to school and took a boatload of viticulture and chemistry and ecology and micro fermenter processes. Like it actually was a lovely, lovely course. But what I did know was the farm and farming, how farming works on a farm, before I started thinking about anything else.
That's what I find so inspiring about your story, is that you had this idea and you made it happen. And really it was, I guess, I'm a deep end kind of woman, right? If you want to try something, then try it. So we planted 10 acres on the farm. The idea caught root. We started, no pun intended. And it's early. And then the idea just grew. Like it seemed to develop a life of its own. And that period between when we first went in the ground, 2007, are a little blurry in my memory, because there was so much learning that was happening. There were so many new things that were being developed on the farm. And I still had 3 school-age children. So that's a lot to take on.
Well, yeah, but when you jump in with both feet, you don't end up having to worry about anything, because you're so deeply in it. Now you're just doing and learning. And the tough thing about doing and learning is, in farming and in winemaking, you only get to do and learn once a year. So you have to pay attention.
So how long does it take for a vine to mature in order to be ready to actually
produce wine from that?
So you get your first crop about 30 months after you go into the ground. It's generally somewhere between, 25 and 50% of what might come to be a typical yield. But there are a lot of folks that argue, and certainly my experience would tell me that you need 7 years to really start seeing what the plants can offer. Meanwhile, you better use that time to start figuring out how you want to make wine, what the expression of your place might be. This was an entirely new place. Everyone was going in the ground with great hopes, and the outcomes were a little mysterious. Science will tell you some things, but terroir expresses itself in interesting ways. And so really, you have to wait and see what the land is going to give you.
I could be wrong, but the age of the vine itself produces a different type of grape.
Yep.
So it could be the same family of grapes, but a younger vine would produce something one way as comparison to an older vine, right?
Well, there's an evolution, yes. And I think it's generally agreed that older vines produce more interesting fruit. But you've invested decades into getting to older vines.
Yeah. And then, something terrible comes along and you're kind of sitting there going, what do I do now?
Yeah. I mean, that's the difference between wine and the other beverage alcohols, right? Because winemakers deal with vintage. So during harvest, they begin the creation of that vintage's wine, and they'll work on that for as long as necessary. Whereas beer and spirits can start and complete different batches of their product over and over again throughout the year. I think that it is what makes wine precious and special. What wine does is capture our history, traps a year in a bottle, and it has the essence of the place that it's grown. It has the essence of the cellar it was raised in. I mean, it's particularly noticeable from the small wineries around the world.
Your winery, the Grange Winery, uses traditional methods.
We do.
What are those methods, and how do those methods differ from large producers?
We stick to basics.
Okay.
So we don't.
So you're not stomping with your feet. You're.
I am. No, that would be really, really traditional and probably a lot of fun. But no, I do use equipment.
Right.
So I have pumps. We can pump the must and the juice around. So we don't have to use buckets. And I have a de-stemmer, so we don't have to take the berries off the stems. And I have a press, so we don't have to squish the grapes.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, we tend to let nature take its course. So we're fairly non-interventionist. We're not trying to manipulate the wines to suit our preferences, I guess would be the simplest way to put that.
Yeah. So when your wine's fermenting, you kind of let it do its thing.
I do.
Would larger chains and larger producers try and speed that process up to produce more of it, I guess?
Well, you're not going to get more. You might get
faster.
It faster. You may be able to push sort of the perfect fermentation conditions into the environment and into the wine. You can introduce yeast cultures that vary the profile of the wine. You can create cultures that are quite robust, and they'll get along with the business of converting all of that beautiful, beautiful grape sugar into alcohol more quickly. In some ways, it's arguable that getting through primary fermentation quickly reduces your risk, but I have found that slower fermentations derived from sort of the inherent yeast culture in the fields and in the cellar yield very interesting results. You don't see that in the same way in big brands because, like all big brands, and here I'm going to say it because it's true, all big brands look for homogeny, right? They want to deliver to people the same every year. Their idea of a sustainable brand is one that people can grow to count on and expect it to taste in a certain way.
Yeah.
I often joke it's like Coca-Cola, right? You expect Coca-Cola to always taste like Coke, but I would never personally have those same expectations about a wine that I was hoping to drink. In fact, I'd be looking for the differences from year to year.
Your wine, the Almanacs, are designed to change over time, but the big producers that always have that more consistent product.
Right. And it is that, like, we actually deliberately chose the word almanac because almanacs, particularly farmers' almanacs, are designed to give you a snapshot of a year. And that's what these wines are. They're a snapshot of a specific year on the farm from the red perspective and from the white perspective. So we blend all our white grapes that we grow into the white, and that's Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, and Riesling. And we blend all the reds, Gamay, Pinot Noir, and Cab Franc, into the red blend. However, how much of each goes in is dictated by nature, by the vintage year. It reflects the bounty of the farm. We developed a labeling format that identifies in descending order the grapes that are in the bottle. It's always the same 3 grapes. It might be that Pinot Noir would appear first and then Gamay and then Cab Franc, or as was the case in the vintage, I believe it was 2014, was Cabernet Franc, Gamay, and then Pinot Noir. So we have a way of communicating with folks and letting them know from the label what's in the bottle, but really what's in the bottle is a picture of a year.
This is the Kitchen Confession Podcast. We're talking to Caroline, owner of the Grange of Prince Edward Winery. You mentioned Prince Edward County was a developing wine region.
That's true.
How does the climate affect our crops?
Anyone can talk about elements or attributes of wines from around the world that are kind of unique. And the uniqueness of the fruit that grows in different regions is driven in 2 ways: from the ground, from the earth where it grows. And then there are other elements of the ground that add differences or interests to the fruit that you grow. And then where you get vintage variation is the way that weather plays out every year. We tend to look at a data set that's about 100 years long and say that on average, you might have this temperature in the winter, this temperature in the summer, this much rainfall, this much humidity. Things like that are predicted in climate data. Weather
is how you get those averages, right? And weather, in my opinion, often has a blatant disregard for climate. But that does drive vintage variation. If the weather was the same every year, if the weather was a direct reflection of the climate, the wines that we make would be the same every year. And in fact, what's interesting about wine, what's beautiful about wine, is its ability to reflect a year. It's why we label the wines by vintage. They're vintage specific because each year gives you a unique set of conditions that create the fruit that becomes the wine. Does that make sense?
It does. So the climate, depending on whether it's warm, hot, rainy conditions, that determines what type of grape you're going to grow.
In effect, yes. The 100-year set or that average of weather would tell you what kind of plant
can survive.
You might be successful growing in that region. But then from year to year, you have weather that creates variances in the actual fruit that you're able to produce. This can get as narrow as sometimes I'll make Pinot Noir that's only from a certain field or only a certain part of a certain field because it tastes different. So, apart from any wine that's made that's terroir driven is inherently a niche product. There's always a finite amount of it. And of course, that's compounded by the fact that you can only pick once a year and you get what you get. Mother Nature is in some years generous and in some years less generous.
Yeah, I get it.
I'm editing.
Yes, I know.
Sometimes less generous aren't the words I'm thinking.
Exactly, yeah. A couple of other choice words you probably have.
Yeah, but I mean, think about it. Your entire future production is tied up in, months worth of growing that is always fragile, always at the mercy of nature.
So what type of fruit can we produce here as opposed to
in Ontario?
Yeah, as opposed to, so when I went to California, they have Pinots, they have Shiraz, and there's specific grapes, I guess, what I'm trying to get at is that they use for these types of vintages.
Interestingly, you often see in very mature wine regions, the regions becoming specialists for certain varietals. The warmer the climate, they tend to skew toward the bigger, heavier reds. For example, everyone would know this, they grow Zinfandel in California. They do not grow Zinfandel in Ontario. One of the most widely planted grapes in Ontario is Riesling, and Riesling is quite celebrated from Ontario. In Prince Edward County, and I do grow Riesling, but when I started planting on our family farm, my first thought was for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay for two reasons. One, because the soil really seemed to lend itself to those varieties, but also the climate seemed to be suitable, right? We had a long enough growing season. We do not have as long a growing season as California, for example. So lots of folks talk about challenges in some years ripening grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon that require a longer hang time.
Oh, okay.
Generally accepted varieties, certainly
or ones that are more broadly planted for Ontario would be Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, Riesling. There is some Sauvignon Blanc.
Are these specific types of grapes that are named?
Yeah, those are plant names, grape names. So they're an actual Vitis vinifera variety.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots and lots of them. Some that are common around the world and some that are specific to different countries or regions within countries. The ones I mentioned are certainly planted around the world. You talk about Pinot Noir from California. The most famous Pinot Noir region in the world, in my opinion, is Burgundy.
Mm-hmm.
It's so associated with Burgundy that people just call the wine Burgundy. They don't mention Pinot Noir. But that's the grape variety that's in it, in the same way that Beaujolais is Gamay. But we know that they grow Pinot Noir beautifully in Oregon. They grow it in New Zealand as well. Pinot Noir tends to be most beautiful in those edgier places in the world. The vines are challenged more. So, of course, because all grape growers and winemakers say things like this, we think that Prince Edward County offers a unique set of terroir and climatic conditions that will allow us to produce a very unique and beautiful Pinot Noir to add to the global spectrum.
Oh, and I love Pinot.
Who doesn't love Pinot? It goes with everything.
I think I found 2 people in this entire planet that don't like Pinot, which I was shocked. But so I guess that leads me back to when we were talking about how Prince Edward County was developing as a wine region.
Right. And it hasn't been that long, a couple of decades, really. I mean, there were there was one planting in the mid 80s and another in the early 90s. And I think that those 2 visionary folks kind of sparked the imagination of a handful of folks. And it built in the beginning actually rather slowly. Everyone was excited but cautious. I remember some of the local farmers coming to talk to my dad and saying, "Why on earth would you let her do that?"
Really?
Well, compared to other forms of farming, there are a couple of challenges for that because climatically, Prince Edward County is the second driest region in Ontario. Cash crops usually need a good amount of rain to really produce bountiful crops. So I think that farmers in the county were often challenged by that. The other problem in my neck of the woods on the west side of the county is that our first and best crop is rock. So these are rough, rocky, gravelly soils. The joke has always been, in the spring, go out and pick your crop of rock or you're going to regret it, right? Because it'll just rip your equipment apart.
Really? I did not realize it was that dry.
Yeah, so our hedgerows. Well, and this is actually important when you're thinking about grapes. The bedrock is non-construction grade calcium-based limestone. That's awesome for growing grapes on. It's got a very distinctive mineral profile. But what it means is that we're growing on fragile rock that is susceptible to penetration by water and, of course, by large plant roots. And when you get the frost in every winter. It actually breaks the rocks apart. So we are constantly producing new gravel as winters play out in the calcium underpinning the land.
That is so interesting.
Yeah, it is till you're cultivating or trying to dehill and you hit a big old rock, and
I can imagine that wouldn't go very well.
Another visit to your best friend, the welder, right?
Yeah. It would probably be more cost effective to have a welder in the family.
I'm working on it. I have 3 children. I am lucky that my daughter decided to join me and help me and work with me and share her vision for the farm. Mm-hmm. But neither of the boys have shown any proclivity to wanting to weld, and
we'll have to work on that.
I have encouraged it numerous times.
I'm sure.
Wouldn't you like to do this, honey?
I wanted to end with something for our listeners. What's something that might surprise our listeners about life on a farm?
Well, I know something that surprises our visitors often, because I think when we live in the city and we think about farming, we think about this connection to nature, idyllic places with plants waving in the breeze, the sunshine coming down. And when they come and visit, particularly during harvest, they're often surprised that a farm is actually noisier and what's the right word? Farms are the place where humans sort of match themselves against nature. And, there is that struggle to try to wrestle your crop out of Mother Nature's hands. And there are years where she seems like she doesn't want to give it to you at all. Mm-hmm. So it can seem a little bit more like, I don't want to say a battle zone, that sounds terrible, but there's more struggle. There is more challenge and there's more struggle than people imagine. It's a lot of hard work to farm, and probably also dirtier than people think it's going to be, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Given that it involves a lot of dirt.
Even hearing all this, after talking to you, I still want to come and live with you guys.
Well, I'm
live
totally
on the farm.
open to that. I just have this one rule. Everyone who lives on the farm works on the farm.
I'm in. I'm done. I'm doing it. No more city living for me. It's that time. We've reached the end of another show. Be sure to visit kitchenconfession.com for more recipes and foodie finds. I'd like to thank producer and editor Matt Agnew, and I'm Mary Mameliti. See you at the next episode.